Adah's life ended in tragedy after she fell victim to Pastor Emmanuel's manipulation and abuse. Sent to him for prayers and spiritual guidance, Adah endured emotional and physical torment in silence. Her cries for help were unheard, her parents blinded by their trust in the pastor. When she discovered she was pregnant, Pastor Emmanuel gave her a bottle of liquid, insisting it would solve her problem. The substance cost her life, leaving her parents, Grace and John, devastated. After Adah's death, Grace discovered her daughter's secret notes, which revealed the pastor's evil deeds. The revelation shattered their world. Yet, despite their anger and guilt, they were too afraid to confront him, knowing his influence and power in the church and community. But their silence allowed Pastor Emmanuel to continue targeting more young girls, as whispers of his deeds began to circulate among a few brave voices. Now, in part 2, Grace and John struggle with fear, guilt, and threats, while a new force begins to rise, one that could change everything. Grace stood in the kitchen, staring at the steaming cup of tea in her hands. The house was quiet, but her thoughts were loud. It had been weeks since she and John stopped going to church. Weeks since they last saw Pastor Emmanuel. But every day, the weight of guilt pressed harder on her chest. Her daughter was gone. Gone because of the man she had trusted, the man she had praised as a man of God. Grace's hands trembled as she thought of Adah's face, her eyes filled with a silent plea for help that Grace had been too blind to see. Grace, John's voice broke her thoughts. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his face lined with worry. He looked older now, the stress and guilt aging him in ways time never could. "You've been standing there for 10 minutes. Are you okay?" Grace shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm not okay, John. I'll never be okay. We let him kill our daughter." John walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We didn't know. We trusted him, just like everyone else. But we should have known." Grace's voice cracked. "A mother should protect her child. I failed, John. I failed her." "We both did," John said softly. "But we can't change the past. All we can do now is survive." Grace nodded weakly, but in her heart, she didn't want to just survive. She wanted to do something, anything, to make up for what they had allowed to happen. At the House of Divine Miracles, Pastor Emmanuel stood before the congregation, his voice booming. "Beware of those who let the devil into their hearts," he declared, his eyes scanning the crowd. "There are people who have turned away from God. They spread lies and falsehoods to destroy his work, but the Lord will punish them in his time." The congregation murmured in agreement, their faces filled with awe and devotion. Pastor Emmanuel smiled inwardly. He knew Grace and John had stopped attending. He had noticed their absence and heard the whispers, but he also knew fear was a powerful tool. He would make sure they stayed silent. After the service, he called one of his loyal church members, a woman named Sister Deborah, into his office. "I need you to visit Grace and John," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Remind them of their commitment to God. Tell them I am praying for them." Sister Deborah nodded. "Yes, Pastor." As she left the office, Pastor Emmanuel leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. Grace and John would learn that no one could escape him. The knock on the door came late in the evening. Grace's heart raced as she exchanged a glance with John. He walked cautiously to the door and peered through the peephole. Seeing Sister Deborah, he sighed and opened it slightly. "Good evening, Brother John," Sister Deborah said with a forced smile. "I came to check on you and Sister Grace. The pastor has been worried about you." "We're fine. John replied curtly. "Tell the pastor not to worry." Sister Deborah tilted her head. "It's unusual for you to miss so many services. You know how important it is to stay connected to God's house." "We're taking some time for ourselves," John said, his voice firm. Sister Deborah's smile faltered. "I understand. But remember, the devil works hardest on those who isolate themselves. The pastor says you mustn't let fear or doubt pull you away from God." John nodded stiffly and closed the door. As the lock clicked into place, Grace exhaled shakily. "They're watching us," she whispered. "Let them watch," John said, but his eyes betrayed his own fear. The days dragged on uneasily for Grace and John. Every knock at the door made Grace's heart jump. She stopped opening the windows, afraid someone might see her inside. John became restless, pacing the living room every evening as if waiting for something bad to happen. One night, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, John broke the silence. "We can't keep living like this, Grace." Grace looked up from her hands. "What choice do we have? If we try to fight him, he'll destroy us." "He's already destroying us," John said bitterly. "We can't sleep. We can't breathe. We've lost everything." Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, but John was right. Adah's death had taken everything from them: peace, hope, even their faith. Now, the pastor's shadow loomed over their lives, refusing to let them move on. It was a quiet afternoon when the letter arrived. Grace found it on the doorstep, a plain white envelope with no name or return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with words scrawled in bold black ink. "You can't run from God's work. Don't make me come after you." Grace gasped and dropped the letter like it was on fire. "John," she called out, her voice shaking. John came rushing from the bedroom. "What is it?" She pointed to the letter on the floor, unable to speak. John picked it up and read it. His face darkened with anger. "That man, he's trying to scare us." Grace's voice wavered. "What if he means it? What if he comes after us?" John clenched his fist. "Let him try. I'll protect you." But Grace didn't feel safe. That night, she barely slept, flinching at every sound outside. The final straw came 2 nights later. They returned home from the market to find their living room window shattered. Inside, they found a rock on the floor with another note tied to it. This time it read, "This is your last warning. Obey God's will." Grace collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with fear. John paced the room, muttering angrily under his breath. "We can't stay here, Grace. It's not safe anymore." "Where will we go?" Grace asked, tears streaming down her face. "We have no one, John." "We'll figure it out," he said firmly, "but we can't let him control us like this." The next morning, they packed their belongings. Grace packed a small suitcase with clothes and some of Adah's things, her favorite scarf, a photo of her smiling at the beach, and her phone with the notes Grace had read over and over. They left before sunrise, taking a bus out of the city. Grace watched the familiar streets fade into the distance, her chest tight with a mix of fear and sadness. She didn't know where they were going or what they would do next. All she knew was that they had to survive. John held her hand tightly as they sat in silence. Neither of them spoke, but both felt the heavy weight of the past following them like a shadow. The bus ride was long and quiet. Grace stared out of the window, watching unfamiliar landscapes roll by. She clutched Adah's scarf in her lap, her fingers gripping the fabric tightly. Every so often, she glanced at John, whose eyes were fixed ahead, his jaw clenched. He hadn't spoken much since they left, but she could feel the storm of thoughts in his mind. "We'll find somewhere safe," he finally said, breaking the silence. "We'll start fresh." Grace nodded weakly. She wanted to believe him, but the fear in her heart wouldn't let go. "Do you think he'll come after us?" John didn't answer right away. He exhaled deeply, leaning his head back against the seat. "I don't know, Grace, but we can't live like prisoners anymore." They arrived in a small, quiet town, hours away from the city. It was a place where no one knew them, where they could disappear. The town was peaceful, with narrow streets lined with old houses, and a market square bustling with friendly faces. Grace and John rented a modest one-room apartment above a bakery. The space was small, but it felt like a haven compared to the suffocating fear they had left behind. For the first time in weeks, Grace slept without jumping at every sound, but peace was fleeting. The weight of Adah's death still clung to them. Grace spent her days sitting by the window, staring at nothing. She kept Adah's phone by her side, scrolling through her notes again and again. Each word felt like a dagger to her heart. John, meanwhile, threw himself into work, taking odd jobs around town to keep busy. He came home late every evening, exhausted and distant. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing day. Back in the city, Pastor Emmanuel sat in his office, staring at the empty pews of the church. His expression was cold, his mind racing. "Grace and John have left," Sister Deborah said hesitantly, standing in front of him. "Their house is empty." Pastor Emmanuel's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. "Do you know where they went?" "No, Pastor," Sister Deborah replied, her voice trembling. "They didn't tell anyone." For the first time, a flicker of anger crossed his face. "They think they can run from me," he muttered under his breath. He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "I gave them everything, prayers, guidance, hope. And this is how they repay me?" Sister Deborah stayed silent, watching as the pastor's calm facade began to crack. "Find them," he ordered sharply. "I don't care how. I want to know where they are." "Yes, Pastor," Sister Deborah said, before hurrying out of the room. Grace was sitting by the window one afternoon when she noticed a young woman walking up the street. She was tall, with short, braided hair and a confident stride. Something about her felt different. She didn't look like someone from the town. The woman stopped at the bakery downstairs, speaking briefly to the shopkeeper before heading toward the staircase. Grace's heart began to race as footsteps echoed up the stairs. There was a knock at the door. Grace hesitated, glancing at John, who was sitting at the small table in the corner. "I'll get it," he said, standing up and walking to the door. He opened it cautiously. "Good afternoon," the woman said, her voice calm and steady. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to speak with you both. It's about Pastor Emmanuel." Grace froze. She exchanged a nervous glance with John before standing slowly. "Who are you?" John asked, his voice guarded. "My name is Amaka," the woman said, stepping forward slightly. "I know what he did to your daughter, and I think you know too." Grace's breath caught in her throat. How do you know about Adah?" Amaka gave them a small, sad smile. "Because I've been investigating Pastor Emmanuel for months. You're not the only ones he's hurt." Amaka stepped into the small apartment, her eyes scanning the modest room before settling on Grace and John. She could see the exhaustion on their faces, the weight of loss and fear that clung to them like a shadow. "Please," Grace said softly, motioning to the small couch. "Sit." Amaka nodded and took a seat. She placed her bag on the floor and folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm but serious. "I know this must feel unexpected," she began, "but I came here because I believe we share a common goal." John leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "What goal is that?" "To expose Pastor Emmanuel for what he truly is," Amaka said firmly. "To stop him from hurting anyone else." Grace's breath caught. She looked at John, her face pale. We can't do that. You don't understand what he's capable of." Amaka met Grace's eyes. "I understand more than you think. I've spoken to other victims, young girls like your daughter Adah, girls who were manipulated and abused by him. Some are too scared to speak out, but their stories are the same. He's been doing this for years." Grace covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes welling with tears. "Years?" Amaka nodded. "He targets vulnerable families, parents who trust him completely, girls who don't know how to fight back. He uses his position as a pastor to silence them, to make them feel like they're the ones doing something wrong." John's voice was tight with anger. "And you think we can stop him? He's too powerful. The church worships him like he's God himself." "That's why I'm here," Amaka said, her tone unwavering. "I'm not just gathering stories, I'm gathering evidence, concrete proof of what he's done. But I need your help." Grace shook her head, her hands trembling. "We can't. We've already lost so much. What if he comes after us again?" "He's already after you," Amaka said gently. "But if you stay silent, he wins. Every day he's free, more girls are at risk." Grace looked down at Adah's scarf, still clutched in her lap. Tears dripped onto the fabric as she whispered, "Couldn't protect her. I failed her." Amaka leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "But you can honor her. Adah's story can help others. You have something powerful, her notes, her voice. It's not too late to fight for her." John's eyes narrowed. "And what happens if we help you? What if it's not enough to stop him?" Amaka reached into her bag and pulled out a small folder. She placed it on the table and opened it, revealing photographs and printed pages. "This is what I've gathered so far," she said. "Testimonies from other victims, screenshots of messages he sent, recordings of him twisting scripture to manipulate people. But I need more. Your daughter's story could be the piece that finally breaks his control." Grace and John stared at the folder. The evidence was damning. Pictures of girls, handwritten accounts, even a blurry recording of the pastor touching a girl's shoulder inappropriately during a prayer session. Grace reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder. She looked at Amaka, her voice trembling. "If we help you, what happens next?" "We take this to the right people," Amaka said. "The media, the authorities, anyone who will listen. But first, we need to be prepared. He's powerful, and he'll do everything he can to silence us. That's why it's important we work together." John hesitated. "You don't know how dangerous he is. If he finds out..." "He won't," Amaka interrupted. "Not if we're careful. I've been doing this for a long time. I know how to stay under the radar." Grace wiped her tears and straightened her back. "If this can help stop him, if this can save another girl from what Adah went through..." She paused, her voice breaking. "Then I'll do it. I'll help you." John looked at her, his jaw tight. "Grace, I've already lost my daughter, John," she said, her voice firm. "I won't let her death be for nothing." John exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. But if this goes wrong..." "It won't," Amaka said confidently. Amaka spent the rest of the afternoon going over the details with Grace and John. She asked Grace to share Adah's notes and any other evidence they might have. She also explained her next steps, gathering more testimonies, building a timeline of the pastor's actions, and preparing for the moment when they would expose him publicly. As night fell, Amaka stood to leave. "Thank you," she said, looking at Grace and John. "I know this isn't easy, but you're doing the right thing." Grace nodded, her grip on Adah's scarf tightening. "Just promise me he'll pay for what he's done." Amaka's eyes hardened. "He will. I'll make sure of it." Amaka left Grace and John's apartment that evening with Adah's notes tucked safely in her bag. She walked down the quiet street, her mind racing with plans. Grace and John's story was more powerful than anything she'd collected so far. With the right approach, it could expose Pastor Emmanuel for what he truly was. But it wouldn't be easy. As she turned a corner, she noticed a car parked across the street. The engine wasn't running, but the headlights flickered for a moment before going dark. Amaka paused, her instincts kicking in. Someone was watching her. She pulled her hood over her head and continued walking, pretending not to notice. Grace sat at the small table, staring at the empty spot where Amaka had laid the folder. Her mind replayed every word the young woman had said. "She's brave," Grace murmured. John, who was sitting by the window, glanced at her. "She's reckless," he muttered. "That pastor isn't just some preacher. He's dangerous." "She's doing what we couldn't," Grace said, her voice trembling. "She's standing up to him. If we don't help her, who will?" John sighed heavily. "I just want us to stay safe, Grace. I don't want to lose you too." Grace stood and walked over to him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can't live in fear forever, John. If we don't fight back, he'll keep doing this to other families. We owe it to Adah." John nodded reluctantly. "I just hope we're ready for what's coming." Amaka spent the next week digging deeper. She reached out to victims she'd spoken to before, encouraging them to share their stories. Some were still too scared, but a few agreed to meet her in secret. One evening, she sat in a small cafe, speaking with a young girl named If. The girl was no older than 16, her hands trembling as she sipped a glass of water. "He told me it was part of God's plan," Ive whispered, her voice barely audible. "He said I should trust him, that it was a blessing." Amaka placed a comforting hand on hers. "You're not alone, Ive. What he did to you was wrong, and I promise we're going to stop him." Ive nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I want to help. I don't want anyone else to go through this." Amaka smiled gently. "Your courage means everything. Thank you." At the House of Divine Miracles, Pastor Emmanuel stood in his office, pacing back and forth. He could feel the tension in the air. "Someone is digging," he muttered to himself. "Someone is trying to ruin me." Sister Deborah entered the room, clutching a notebook. "Pastor, the rumors are growing. People are starting to talk. Some families are even questioning your private sessions." Pastor Emmanuel slammed his hand on the desk, making Sister Deborah flinch. "Silence them. Remind them who I am. Remind them of what I've done for this church." "Yes, Pastor," she said quickly. He leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "And find out who's behind this. I want names." One evening, as Grace and John sat in their apartment, a loud knock echoed through the room. Grace froze, her heart racing. "Who could it be?" she whispered. John stood cautiously, motioning for her to stay back. He approached the door and peered through the peephole. "It's empty," he said, confused. He opened the door slightly, and a folded piece of paper fell to the floor. John picked it up and opened it. The message was chilling. "We know where you are. Stop what you're doing, or you'll regret it." John's hands shook as he showed the note to Grace. Her face turned pale. "He's found us," she whispered, her voice breaking. John's jaw tightened. "We have to tell Amaka. She needs to know he's onto her too." John called Amaka immediately after reading the threatening note. His voice was low and steady, but Grace could hear the fear in it. "They know where we are," he said. "We found a note at the door." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Amaka's voice came through, calm but firm. "I'm on my way. Don't open the door for anyone else. Stay inside and keep the curtains closed." Grace sat at the table, her fingers gripping Adah's scarf tightly. "What if they come back?" she whispered after John hung up. "They won't," John said, though his voice was less confident than his words. When Amaka arrived, she was carrying a small bag slung over her shoulder. She stepped inside quickly, locking the door behind her. Her eyes darted around the room, checking for anything unusual. "Let me see the note," she said. John handed it to her. She unfolded the paper and read it carefully, her face unreadable. "This is his style," Amaka said. "Indirect threats, just enough to scare you into silence." She looked up at them. "But this means we're getting close. He's nervous." "Nervous?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. "This man knows where we live, Amaka. How are we supposed to feel safe?" Amaka knelt down in front of Grace, her expression softening. "I know this is terrifying, but if we back down now, he wins. Every time someone stays silent, he gets stronger. We can't let that happen." Grace swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm scared." "I know," Amaka said gently, "but you're not alone in this. I'm here, and there are others who want to see him stopped. We just have to be careful." Amaka pulled a laptop out of her bag and set it on the table. "We need to move quickly," she said. "The more evidence we have, the harder it will be for him to silence us. Grace, I'm going to digitize Adah's notes. Her words need to be preserved." Grace nodded slowly. "You think her story will be enough?" "It's more than enough," Amaka replied. "Her voice is powerful. It will connect with people. But we need to strengthen the case even more." She turned to John. "Do you remember anything suspicious from your time at the church? Anything that stood out to you about him or how he operates?" John hesitated, then nodded. He was always secretive. He kept a small group of people close. People who'd do anything for him. They handled all the money, the schedules, everything. "That's good," Amaka said. "If we can find someone in that inner circle who's willing to talk, it could break his whole system." Back at the church, Pastor Emmanuel sat in his dimly lit office. A loyal follower, Brother Matthew, stood before him, his hands clasped nervously. "They're not giving up," Matthew said. "That woman, she's still meeting with people." Pastor Emmanuel's eyes narrowed. "This woman, what do you know about her?" "She's been asking questions, meeting with girls who stopped coming to church. People are starting to talk." The pastor leaned back in his chair, his face calm but his eyes cold. "If she wants to play games, let's see how far she's willing to go. Follow her. Find out who she's working with." Matthew nodded quickly. "Yes, Pastor." As Matthew left, Pastor Emmanuel picked up his phone and made another call. "It's time we remind everyone who's in charge," he said quietly. A few days later, Grace and John noticed something unusual. Everywhere they went, the market, the street corner, even the quiet park where Grace sometimes sat, there seemed to be someone watching. John spotted a man sitting in a parked car outside their building one morning. When their eyes met, the man quickly drove off. "He's closing in," John said that evening as they locked the doors and windows. Amaka, who had been spending more time with them to strategize, nodded grimly. "It's intimidation. He wants to scare you into silence, but we won't let him." Grace hugged herself tightly. "What if he tries to hurt us?" "I won't let that happen," Amaka said. She opened her bag and pulled out a small recording device. "From now on, we document everything. If anyone approaches you, record them. If they follow you, take pictures. The more we have, the better." Amaka received a tip from one of the victims she'd interviewed. There was someone in Pastor Emmanuel's inner circle who might be willing to talk. It was a woman named Sister Beatrice, a long-time member of the church who had grown disillusioned with the pastor but was too afraid to leave. Amaka arranged to meet Sister Beatrice in secret at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Grace insisted on coming along, despite John's protests. "I need to do this," Grace said firmly. The meeting was tense. Sister Beatrice arrived wearing a scarf and sunglasses, her hands shaking as she sat down. "If he finds out I'm talking to you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He won't," Amaka assured her. "We'll protect you, but we need your help." Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. "I know things that could destroy him. But if I talk, I need to know it'll make a difference." "It will," Grace said, her voice steady. "We'll make sure of it." Sister Beatrice sat with her hands folded tightly on the table, her knuckles white from the pressure. Her voice trembled as she began to speak. "Pastor Emmanuel isn't what he seems," she said quietly. "For years I've watched him manipulate people, especially the young girls. He uses his power to silence them, to control their families, and those who try to resist, they pay the price." Grace leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What do you mean? What kind of price?" Beatrice swallowed hard, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be listening. "There was a family once, a man who tried to expose him. Pastor Emmanuel destroyed him. He had people spread lies about the man's wife, saying she was unfaithful. He called it God's punishment for turning against his chosen servant." Amaka nodded. "I've heard similar stories, but we need more. Something solid, something undeniable. Do you have any proof?" Beatrice hesitated, then lowered her voice even further. "He keeps records, everything, payments, names, details about the families he targets. He says it's for prayer purposes, but I've seen the files. He keeps them locked in a cabinet in his office at the church." Amaka's eyes lit up. "If we can get those files, it's over for him." Grace's heart raced. "But how will you get them? He'll never let you near that cabinet." Amaka sat back, her mind working quickly. "I'll find a way. If those files exist, they're the key to bringing him down." Back at the church, Pastor Emmanuel's patience was running thin. Reports from Brother Matthew and Sister Deborah confirmed his suspicions. Someone was digging too deeply. He paced his office, his movements sharp and agitated. "They think they can challenge me. They think they can ruin everything I've built." Sister Deborah shifted nervously in her seat. "What do you want us to do, Pastor?" "Watch them all," he snapped. "The families, the girls, anyone who might turn against me. And find that woman, Amaka. She's the one stirring this up." Deborah nodded. "Yes, Pastor. We'll handle it." Pastor Emmanuel sat down, his hands gripping the edge of his desk, but his calm facade was cracking. He could feel the walls closing in. That night, Amaka called Grace and John to share her plan. "We need to get into his office," she said. Those files are the final piece of the puzzle. John frowned. You're talking about breaking into the church? That's insane. It's risky, yes, Amaka admitted. But if we don't act now, he'll keep getting away with it. Every day we wait, more girls are at risk. Grace looked at John, her expression filled with determination. She's right. We've come this far. We can't stop now. John sighed heavily. If something happens to you, Grace, I'll be fine, Grace said firmly. We have to do this for Adah. Late that night, Amaka and Grace made their way to the church. The building was quiet, the lights dimmed. Amaka had a plan to distract the security guard while Grace slipped into the pastor's office. As Grace entered the office, her heart pounded in her chest. The room was dark, the shadows stretching across the walls. She spotted the cabinet in the corner, just as Beatrice had described. She approached it slowly, her hands trembling as she pulled on the handle. Locked. Amaka, she whispered into the small earpiece they were using. It's locked. Check the desk, Amaka whispered back. He might have a key there. Grace began searching the desk drawers, her fingers moving quickly. Suddenly, a noise outside the door made her freeze. Footsteps. Someone's coming, she whispered. Stay calm, Amaka said. Hide if you have to, but don't leave without those files. Grace ducked behind the desk, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. The door handle turned,